Hey guys, tonight we walk into the dim red glow of ancient Mesopotamia, where clay tablets dry on reed mats, temple smoke curls into the evening air, and a few stubborn lines of Akkadian text may hint at a story larger than the one officially preserved. Some parts of tonight's journey are widely accepted history, some parts are interpretation, and some parts are calm, careful, what-if imagination. Because historians debate plenty of this, and the tablets themselves are not exactly chatty in modern plain English. You are stepping into a world of scribes' gods, labour memory, and political storytelling, which means you probably would not survive this very well without a clerk, a translator, and a very patient donkey. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're settling in, post your location and local time down in the comments. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You move first through the dust, not dramatic golden dust, not magical sparkles floating in a perfect museum spotlight, but the ordinary powder of ancient mud brick, pulverized reed and time itself. It clings to your sandals and settles in the folds of your clothes as you step into a city that in one form or another helps shape the Akkadian world. The air smells faintly of warm clay river damp and human effort. Somewhere nearby, grain is being measured. Somewhere else, wool is being counted. A scribe bends over a tablet with the expression of a man who has already had enough of everybody before lunch. Most historians agree that Mesopotamian civilization depended on writing for administration long before later empires made archives feel grand and ceremonial. At first, writing is mostly practical. Who owes barley? Who delivered copper? Which temple received sheep? Which official claims with suspicious confidence that absolutely no one misplaced the grain allotment? Human nature, it turns out, gets started early and never really clocks out. But the evidence we do have points to something else too. These same scribal traditions do not only track sheep and silver, they preserve stories, hymns, laments, myths, arguments between gods and kings, explanations for why the world feels difficult, ordered, unfair, sacred, and strangely bureaucratic all at once. In that enormous body of writing, Akkadian texts carry forward older Sumerian themes while also reshaping them. That matters tonight because when traditions are copied from one language into another, memory does not move like a sealed jar. It leaks, it changes flavour, it picks up fingerprints. One interpretation is that some broken Akkadian passages preserve the shadow of an older tension between divine groups, especially those later readers identify as the Igigi and the Anunnaki. That is not the same as saying a hidden truth has been found under a spotlight with dramatic music. Let me rephrase that more carefully. What we have are fragments, parallels, echoes and patterns that may suggest a tension worth paying attention to. That's a possibility, not a certainty. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. We'll keep the solid ground separate from the mist. Still, the mist has a way of looking interesting at night. You can almost hear the scrape of the stylus, not pencil on paper, but reed pressing into damp clay, line by line, wedge by wedge. Cuneiform looks neat in photographs, but up close it feels physical. Every sign is a tiny shove into matter. Somebody's wrist has to ache. Somebody has to decide what gets copied and what does not. Somebody has to believe that memory belongs on a tablet instead of in the unreliable attic of the human brain. Honestly, after 5 minutes of trying to memorize tax records in summer heat, you would probably become a writing enthusiast too. Archaeology suggests that scribal schools train students through repetition, copying model text again and again until the signs became muscle memory. That means ancient literature is never far from ancient education. A myth survives not only because it is sacred or entertaining, but because someone makes a young apprentice copy it while trying not to smudge the corners. In other words, civilization rests partly on bored students. reassuring really. Now picture one of these tablets in your hands. It is not complete. Its edges are chipped. The top may be missing. The bottom may have dissolved centuries ago. There are lines scholars can read, lines scholars can debate, and lines that simply trail off into damage. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. That is especially true when later interpretations build big theories on small spaces. A fringe idea proposes that certain Akkadian texts preserve a memory of the Igigi making some form of arrangement with humanity, a relationship later overshadowed by traditions that emphasize higher divine authority. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it remains interesting because it tries to explain why some stories feel less tidy than official theology might prefer. What's broadly accepted is simpler and steadier. Mesopotamian myths often imagine the gods in ranks with duties, personalities, and conflicts that reflect the world below. Divine labour, divine complaint, divine hierarchy. Human kingship mirrors heavenly order. Temple life mirrors cosmic order. Work is everywhere. Irrigation canals do not dig themselves. Grain does not thresh itself. Bricks do not politely stack themselves out of respect for your schedule. A careful reading might suggest that when myths describe divine strain, they are also reflecting human realities. The gods grumble because people grumble. The heavens sound administrative because the river valley is administrative. And then, somewhere in that overlap between myth and labour, the Igigi begin to shimmer into view. Not clearly, never clearly. They arrive as part of a larger mythic atmosphere, a category of divine beings that later readers often treat as younger gods, worker gods or subordinate gods in relation to higher powers. The labels vary. The texts do not always cooperate with modern neatness. Historians still argue whether these categories were consistently defined across time and place, or whether later systems have been pressed too firmly onto older, messier traditions. That uncertainty matters more than it might seem. If the groups are fluid in the text, then the relationships between them may be fluid too. And fluid relationships are exactly where stories start getting interesting. Suppose you are a scribe copying an old tradition into Akkadian. You inherit names, roles and tensions from earlier material, but you also live in a political world that likes order. Empires like order. Temples like order. Priests like order. Officials absolutely adore order, at least when it is being imposed on someone else. So when an older myth contains friction among divine beings, you may smooth it, or sharpen it, or leave it oddly vague. A careful reading might suggest that vagueness is not always accidental. Sometimes ambiguity is the neatest way to preserve something awkward without saying it out loud. What if the story is pointing at something else? Not a secret code with flashing arrows and a narrator yelling revelation every 5 seconds. Sleepy history does not need that kind of energy. But perhaps a clue. Perhaps a surviving mood. Perhaps the faint outline of a bargain not stated in legal language, but lingering in how certain beings relate to labouring humanity. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, the old tablets start to feel less like static scripture and more like conversations between generations, each one deciding what to emphasise, what to soften, and what to leave half buried. You pause near a storehouse wall still warm from the day's heat. Evening is lowering itself over the city. A donkey coughs with deep personal disappointment. Somewhere in the distance, a temple singer is rehearsing words meant for gods, who may or may not appreciate music, but definitely seem to enjoy hierarchy. And there you are, holding the first thread of tonight's puzzle. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. The documented part is firm enough. Akkadian scribes preserved a world of myth layered over practical life. The interpreted part is where the shadows deepen. Some readers think the surviving texts may hint that the Igigi are not only labourers within divine order, but figures linked to a larger question about why humanity exists and whom humanity truly serves. The imagined part is quieter still, What if beneath the official version there once lingered the memory of an uneasy understanding between beings below the highest gods and the people made to carry the weight of earth? You do not know that yet, but you can feel the clay warming in your hands, and that is how these stories begin. The tablet in your hands does not speak with one voice. That is one of the first lessons the Akkadian world quietly teaches you, usually while you are still admiring the clever wedge marks and pretending you would have made an excellent ancient scribe. You would not. Your knees would hurt, your back would complain, and by day 3, you would absolutely be inventing reasons to avoid copying verb forms. But the scribes who do remain at their work are not just copying language, they are shaping memory. Most historians agree that Akkadian quartz temples and administrative centres depend on trained scribes, not only to record transactions, but to preserve the cultural framework of power. Kings issue inscriptions, priests maintain ritual language, officials track labour and offerings. Stories circulate through this same world, and they do not float above politics in some lovely cloud of pure myth. They sit inside systems. They are copied by people employed by institutions. They are remembered in places where memory is useful. So you keep walking. The evening cool settles over the city in layers. First, the stone thresholds lose their heat. Then the reed roofs stop radiating the whole day back into your face like offended ovens. Somewhere someone is still grinding grain. Somewhere else a clerk is reciting totals in the flat tone of a man discovering that mathematics has again ruined his peace. The city is alive with ordinary burdens, and that matters because Akkadian writing grows inside exactly this world of labour, order and ranking. Archaeology suggests that scribal culture in Mesopotamia is intensely conservative in some ways and quietly adaptive in others. Texts are copied, recopied, translated, reshaped and reorganised over centuries. A hymn written in one age may be adapted in another. A Sumerian tradition may survive in Akkadian form. A myth may gain new emphasis as political conditions change. The evidence we do have points to continuity, yes, but also to curation. Memory is not just stored, it is managed. One interpretation is that omission can matter as much as inscription. What a text refuses to explain may be just as revealing as what it spells out in perfect formal lines. That does not mean every silence hides a conspiracy wearing ceremonial jewellery. Let me rephrase that more carefully. Sometimes a silence is just damage. Sometimes a silence is tradition. Sometimes a silence may reflect a choice by generations of copyists who no longer want the old tension stated so plainly. And what if silence itself becomes the eeriest line on the tablet? You begin to notice how official voices like to sound complete. Royal inscriptions tend to love clarity, especially when the clarity is flattering. The king built this. The god favoured that. Order has been restored. Chaos has been politely escorted off the premises. But mythic literature, even when copied in formal settings, often preserves friction. Gods argue. Humans suffer. Floods happen. Work never really ends. The world feels arranged, but not comfortably. It is less like a polished theory and more like a family business where everybody outranks you and nobody agrees on the spreadsheet. What's broadly accepted is that Akkadian scribes inherit a huge body of earlier Mesopotamian thought, much of it Sumerian in origin, and adapt it into their own literary and political world. That adaptation is not neutral. Translation never is. Move a story from one language to another, and you also move assumptions, emphasis, and tone. A careful reading might suggest that some divine relationships become more systematized in later retellings, as if the rough edges of older stories are being filed down for cleaner presentation. A more cautious explanation could be that later scholars simply prefer tidy categories, when the ancient material is less tidy than they wish. Historians still argue whether the surviving arrangement of divine groups in Akkadian texts reflects a stable old theology or a later habit of organising scattered traditions into something more orderly. That matters because tonight's puzzle depends not only on what the tablets say, but on how later readers arrange what they say. If the Igigi and Anunnaki are treated as neat ranks in a divine chart, the story looks one way. If those categories shift across texts and centuries, the story becomes more complicated. And complication is where erased possibilities like to hide. You pass through a narrow lane beside a wall marked with fading mud plaster. A lamp burns behind a doorway. The smell of oil, wool and old smoke drifts out into the darkening street. Inside, maybe a student is repeating signs under his breath. Maybe a senior scribe is reviewing a damaged tablet filling gaps from memory, trying to decide whether a missing phrase should be restored from one version or left uncertain. It sounds academic now. In practice, it is one of the most powerful acts in the ancient world. To restore a line is to shape the future reading of the past. The evidence we do have points to scribes as both preservers and editors. Not editors in the modern red pen, coffee-fueled, aggressively italicized sense, though the spirit may be eternal. More in the sense that every act of copying carries judgment. Which recension is preferred? Which variant looks authoritative? Which phrase sounds old enough to be respectable? Which awkward detail gets smoothed because it no longer fits the theology or political taste of the moment? Ancient memory is not a frozen photograph. It is wet clay handled again and again. A fringe idea proposes that this process of scribal handling may have gradually buried traces of a more complicated relationship between humanity and lower divine figures like the Igigi, especially if older stories once pictured them less as simple subordinates and more as agents caught in their own disputes with higher powers. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it appeals to people because it fits the emotional texture of Mesopotamian myth. The gods in these stories are rarely bland symbols. They complain, they struggle, they negotiate, they punish, they relent. They sound frankly like immortals forced into management meetings. Still, we are not proving anything tonight, we're following clues. The documented clue is this: scribes serve institutions that value continuity and legitimacy. Most historians agree that royal and temple power in Mesopotamia depend heavily on presenting the cosmos as ordered, ranked and meaningful. The king is not random, the temple is not random, labour obligations are not random. Everything belongs somewhere. In such a world, stories that stress hierarchy fit comfortably. Stories that blur responsibility or suggest inconvenient alliances may not vanish completely, but they could become harder to see. That is a possibility, not a certainty. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. You stop near a scribal room where tablets are stacked on shelves or laid in baskets, each one a small square of durable thought. Some contain contracts, some contain lexical lists, some contain myths that outlive their copyists by thousands of years. The room smells like clay oil and concentration. There is no dramatic soundtrack, no hidden chamber opens, no priest whispers at last the forbidden truth. Ancient history is usually less theatrical than that. It is more like squinting at fragments while somebody in the background argues about grain storage. And yet in this quiet room, the idea of erasure begins to feel less like fantasy and more like ordinary practice. Not total erasure, not a giant cosmic delete button, just the slow preference for one framing over another. One god elevated, one tension minimised, one ambiguity left unresolved until later readers stop noticing it. A careful reading might suggest that this is how a possible deal, if anything like one ever existed in the tradition, could fade from explicit statement into mood and residue. Not because every scribe joins a grand cover-up, but because institutions reward clarity that supports order. Over time, what survives most strongly is the version that best flatters the structure above it. And you still walking through the Akkadian night begin to understand that memory is never only about what remains. It is also about what remains in charge. That sense of rank hangs in the air with the smoke. You feel it as you move closer to the temple quarter, where the streets widen just enough to remind you that power likes space. Mud brick walls rise in clean plains. Storerooms lean against sacred compounds. Steps lead upward toward courtyards, where offerings, prayers, and accounting all mingle with impressive efficiency. Ancient religion, like modern office culture, has a remarkable talent for involving paperwork. The gods may be immortal, but somebody still has to track the barley. And here in the middle distance between heaven and ledger, the Igigi begin to take on shape. What's broadly accepted is that Mesopotamian texts refer to different classes or assemblies of gods, though the details vary across time, language, and genre. Some names remain more stable than others. Some roles seem clearer in one period and blur in another. The Igigi appear in Akkadian literature as a recognisable divine group, but exactly what that means in every text is less certain than a tidy chart might suggest. Most historians agree that the ancient material does not always behave like a single unified theology textbook. It behaves more like a pile of inherited traditions that keep being adjusted by human hands. Which is rude, really. You wait 4,000 years for cosmic clarity, and instead you get fragments, overlaps, and scholarly footnotes with the emotional warmth of damp bread. Still, the evidence we do have points to an important pattern. In several Mesopotamian traditions, the gods are not all doing the same thing. There are higher-ranking powers, local deities, patron gods, cosmic authorities, and divine assemblies, whose functions seem connected to work, rule, or support. One interpretation is that the Igigi may have stood apart from the greater gods in meaningful ways, not merely as decorative names in a list, but as beings whose role carries tension. A careful reading might suggest they are remembered less as serene rulers than as active participants in the strain of maintaining the world. That does not make them heroes. It does not make them humanity's best friends either. Let me rephrase that more carefully. The texts do not invite us to imagine the Igigi as kindly neighbourhood mentors handing out life advice and artisanal bread. They belong to a divine order that can still feel severe, distant, and dangerous, but their position may be more restless than that of the highest gods. They may occupy the middle ground between command and burden. And that is exactly the sort of position where stories of frustration tend to grow. Archaeology suggests that Mesopotamian religion reflects the social realities of highly organised urban life. There are ranks, duties, expectations, and service obligations everywhere. Kings serve gods, officials serve kings, workers serve institutions, and households serve survival itself. A myth about divine beings who labour under higher authority would not feel strange in such a world. It would feel familiar. A more cautious explanation could be that these stories project human social structures onto the divine rather than preserving literal memories of supernatural politics. That is probably the safer footing. But even on safe footing, the pattern matters. Historians still argue whether the Igigi should be understood consistently as younger gods, worker gods, celestial gods, or simply a divine collective whose meaning shifts according to context. That debate matters because modern readers often want one fixed definition, while ancient literature seems far more comfortable with layered usage. If the term moves, then the emotional tone of the group may move too. In one setting, they may seem subordinate, in another more numerous, in another vaguely celestial, in another connected to complaint or unrest. The mystery is not in finding a single clean answer, but in noticing how the old terms behave. You drift beneath the shadow of a wall, where faded impressions of reeds still mark the plaster. Somewhere above a lamp flickers from an upper room. You imagine a scholar centuries later bent over a damaged tablet, tracing the signs for the divine determinative, before a name squinting over whether a line belongs to one class of gods or another. The room is quiet except for breath-scraping reed and the soft internal collapse that comes from realising the edge of the tablet is missing exactly where you needed it most. Ancient studies, 90% patience, 10% trying not to yell at clay. A fringe idea proposes that the Igigi preserve a memory of divine figures who were closer to humanity's condition than the Anunnaki-centred traditions later preferred to admit. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it does have a certain eerie logic. If lower-ranking divine beings are associated with labour, burden, or dissatisfaction, then stories about them might resonate with human listeners in a way that distant cosmic rulers do not. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, the Igigi begin to look less like background names and more like a pressure point in the mythology. What if they were remembered not simply as lesser gods, but as uneasy intermediaries, not saviours, not rebels with excellent branding, just intermediaries, beings close enough to the work of the world to understand burden, but still bound inside a hierarchy that expects obedience? One interpretation is that this middle position could explain why later traditions sometimes feel uncertain around them. Middle figures are awkward. Empires prefer vertical clarity. Temples prefer proper ranking. Stories become tidier when everyone knows their place. But mythology-like people often preserves old discomfort even after the official chart has been drawn. The evidence we do have points especially toward myths in which divine labour becomes a real problem. You're not quite at that scene yet, but you can feel it approaching like distant thunder over a canal plain. The earth needs maintaining, fields need watering, boundaries need upholding, cities rise because labour does not stop. If some divine beings are imagined as doing the exhausting work before humanity enters the story, then the Igigi may not merely occupy a label. They may carry the memory of strain itself. And strain changes how you hear a name. Instead of polished serenity, you hear muttering. Instead of pure transcendence, you hear effort. The gods are still gods, yes, but they are not all equally above the mess. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. The documented part is that the Igigi appear in Akkadian tradition as a meaningful divine group. The interpreted part is that their role may suggest something more dynamic than a simple rank beneath the great gods. The imagined part is the scene now settling around you like warm night air, a world in which the beings below the highest order are carrying more than they want, and beginning to understand that obedience has limits. A popular rumour claims that hidden or lost lines once made the Igigi's position far more dramatic, casting them as protectors, conspirators, or secret allies of humanity. There is no solid evidence for that dramatic version, and we should leave it in the rumour basket where it belongs. But rumours often grow where the text already feels charged. They do not appear from nowhere. They appear because the surviving material contains just enough tension to keep people wondering. And as you stand there under the Mesopotamian night, the smell of warm brick fading into cooler darkness, the wondering becomes hard to ignore. Because if the Igigi were restless, then the whole divine order may have been less settled than the official version wants you to believe. That unsettled feeling follows you upward. Not physically upward in the sense that you suddenly sprout divine clearance and stroll into heaven with a visitor badge, but upward in thought into the more elevated layer of the cosmic order, where the Anunnaki begin to loom over the story. The name itself carries weight. Even now, long after the cities that first spoke it have fallen into dust, it sounds important in the room. Heavy, ranked, a little too formal to be fun at dinner parties. Archaeology suggests that the Anunnaki belong to a broader sacred order in Mesopotamian belief, though exactly how the term functions can vary depending on period language and text. What's broadly accepted is that they are not a modern invention, and not merely late internet decoration attached to ancient myths like glitter on a tax ledger. They are part of the real literary and religious vocabulary of Mesopotamia. But once again, the ancient material resists the kind of clean diagram modern readers love. One text may make the Anunnaki feel like major divine authorities. Another may emphasize the assembly of the gods more generally. Another may leave the relationships implied rather than spelled out. So naturally, humanity responds by turning that ambiguity into 12,000 documentaries, 300 feverish message boards, and at least one man in wraparound sunglasses declaring that everything is obvious. It is not obvious. The clay is old, damaged, and not especially interested in your need for neat closure. Most historians agree that Mesopotamian religion reflects layered tradition rather than one single universal creed. Cities have patron gods. Texts have local emphases. Political shifts reshape sacred language. The evidence we do have points to the Anunnaki as significant divine figures associated with high rank and authority, but one interpretation is that later readers sometimes over-systematize them, arranging every divine name into a rigid chart. The ancient sources themselves do not consistently support. A more cautious explanation could be that the Anunnaki are best understood as part of a flexible divine elite, rather than a permanently fixed cabinet with assigned seats and matching folders. Still, if you are standing inside the story rather than outside it, the emotional effect is clear enough. The Anunnaki feel higher. You move past a broad courtyard where offerings have recently been made. The scent of oil and grain lingers in the air. Somewhere nearby, a priest is finishing a chant. Somewhere else, someone is hauling water with the universal expression of a person who has accepted that gravity is not a negotiable policy. The city around you is built on rank, and rank is not only social, it is cosmological. The temple is higher, the god is higher, the king is higher. The clerk who knows where the grain accounts are hidden is in his own modest way also terrifyingly high. In such a world, stories about divine hierarchy do not feel abstract. They feel like mirrors. One interpretation is that the Anunnaki, as remembered in some traditions, represent more than divine status. They may represent the official face of order itself, not necessarily kind order, not even always comprehensible order, but the kind of order that wants labour-assigned roles defined and disturbances managed before sunrise. If that reading holds even partly true, then any mythic tension involving lower-ranking divine groups would naturally become charged. A conflict among gods is never only about personalities. It reflects how the whole system imagines burden, authority, and responsibility. Historians still argue whether the Anunnaki were understood consistently across Mesopotamian traditions as underworld judges, high gods, or members of a broader divine council whose functions shifted over time. That debate is important because later popular retellings often flatten them into one dramatic role, usually with much more certainty than the evidence deserves. To be clear, this is debated. The ancient texts do not hand us a laminated chart and whisper here, "Darling, now nobody has to argue." Instead, they leave us with patterns, contexts, and a lot of respectful squinting. And the respectful squinting matters tonight because of the imbalance it creates. If the Anunnaki occupy the higher ground of divine authority, then stories about strain below them start to feel political. Not political in the modern campaign slogan sense. No one is hanging posters that read, "Better canals, better cosmos," but political in the deeper sense that rank determines who works, who commands, who gets remembered as necessary, and who gets remembered as decorative. A careful reading might suggest that the higher gods in these narratives are not always insecure exactly, but neither are they free from challenge. Their authority depends on the system holding. If the system frays, their image changes too. What if the highest gods in the story are less secure than they first appear? That is not the same as saying they are weak. It is a question of pressure. Great power often looks calm because it can afford calm. But if a myth quietly preserves unrest beneath the surface, then even the serene faces of the divine order begin to look slightly staged. This is where the idea of erasure becomes tempting. Not total erasure, not a vanished tablet labelled things we absolutely did wrong, but the gradual preference for versions of the story that keep the higher order dignified, coherent, and untroubled by awkward dependence on those below. A fringe idea proposes that later Anunnaki-centered traditions overshadowed earlier memories of divine conflict, in which lower beings, perhaps the Igigi, had more agency than official theology preferred. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it catches attention because it fits something emotionally true about literature. Stories told from above rarely sound the same as stories told from below. If the surviving Akkadian tradition gives more polished space to the high divine order, that does not prove suppression, but it may raise the possibility that the point of view has shifted. The evidence we do have points to Mesopotamian myth as a living body of tradition, not a single author novel with perfect internal consistency. That means tensions can survive even when the overall shape changes. A title remains, a role shifts, an old divine group keeps its name but loses part of its edge. A careful reading might suggest that the Anunnaki in later emphasis become the polished surface of a cosmic arrangement that once sounded rougher, more negotiated, more uneasy. You stop beside a wall where moonlight gathers faintly on pale plaster. In the distance, a dog barks once and then thinks better of it. The city settles. Above you the sky is immense and dry, scattered with stars that ancient Mesopotamians watched with more seriousness than most modern people reserve for tax deadlines. The heavens are not decorative here. They are meaningful, ranked, watched and read. And that is what makes the Anunnaki so important to tonight's atmosphere. They are not only names in a myth, they are the upper architecture of meaning. If they stand secure, the world feels secure. If they depend on others more than the polished version admits, then the whole picture becomes less comfortable. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. The documented part is that the Anunnaki are real figures in Mesopotamian tradition, and often carry the gravity of high divine status. The interpreted part is that later readers may have made them more systematic and more dominant in the narrative than some earlier tensions fully warrant. The imagined part is the feeling now pressing at the edge of the scene. What if the highest order of gods inherits a story already strained by labour below? And what if its calm authority partly depends on not letting that strain speak too loudly? You look back down toward the lower streets. The city is quiet now, but not fully asleep. Somewhere a lamp still burns beside a tablet. And somewhere in the dark, the burden is still climbing upward. That burden has weight long before anyone names it. You feel it first in the canals. Before the stories, before the grand cosmic explanations, before later readers begin turning every divine quarrel into a philosophical puzzle, there is mud. There is water dragged into obedience. There is silt piling where it should not. There are banks to repair channels, to clear fields, to measure seed, to scatter harvest, to guard grain, to store, and tools to mend while pretending your back is not making deeply personal threats. Most historians agree that life in ancient Mesopotamia is shaped by labour on a massive organised scale. Irrigation agriculture supports cities, temples, and kingship, but it also demands constant maintenance. The rivers give life, and then immediately hand you a maintenance schedule. Archaeology suggests that this practical burden sits at the centre of Mesopotamian civilization. You do not get urban density, temple estates, administrative complexity, or elite ritual life without ordinary hands moving earth and water. The evidence we do have points to a society where labour is not background texture. It is the main sound in the room. Hose scrape, baskets lift, mud sucks at ankles, rope burns palms. Somewhere always somebody is being told that the canal wall simply must be repaired by tomorrow, which is ancient history's version of receiving an email marked urgent at 4:52 p.m. And because the world below is built on toil, the myths above it begin to speak that same language. What's broadly accepted is that Mesopotamian myths often mirror the realities of human society. Divine kingship resembles earthly kingship. Sacred order resembles political order. One interpretation is that myths about divine labour and complaint are not random fantasy, but literary reflections of lived burdens. A careful reading might suggest that when ancient listeners heard of gods grumbling under work, they did not hear something remote and abstract. They heard their own shoulders answering back. That is where the story begins to tighten. The old traditions that later Akkadian texts preserve do not imagine the cosmos as effortless. The world is ordered, yes, but not without strain. Some divine beings work, some command, some seem farther from the grind than others. If the Igigi are remembered in any connection to toil, unrest or burden, that would not be strange in this setting. It would make emotional sense. A more cautious explanation could be that divine complaint is simply a mythic device for explaining why humanity is eventually created. That is probably the safer summary, but even the safer summary tells you something important. Creation in these traditions may emerge not from serene generosity, but from pressure. You move out toward the river plain in your imagination, away from the tighter streets, and toward the open geometry of canals and embankments. The night air is cooler here. Reed beds rustle. The smell of damp earth thickens. Somewhere, frogs make the sort of persistent noise that suggests they have no awareness of poetry and no respect for your sleep schedule. In the distance, workers or watchmen murmur near a water gate. Even at rest, the landscape feels like a machine that cannot be turned off for long. Most historians agree that the agricultural world of Mesopotamia creates both wealth and vulnerability. Irrigation can sustain large populations, but it also requires coordination, maintenance, and discipline. Fail to manage water and fields suffer. Fail to organise labour and institutions wobble. A city is only a miracle until you realise it is also a full-time repair project. One interpretation is that myths about exhausted divine workers may preserve in symbolic form a culture-wide awareness that someone always pays for order. Historians still argue whether the labouring gods in Mesopotamian myth should be read mainly as theological figures, social allegory, or some blend of both. That debate matters because tonight's question depends on how we hear their fatigue. If the myth is primarily symbolic, then divine unrest reflects human labour patterns. If the story also preserves older tensions within divine tradition, then the unrest may carry an internal mythic politics as well. That's a possibility, not a certainty. The texts do not hand us a little note saying, by the way, this section is about class conflict in heaven. Ancient literature annoyingly prefers atmosphere to footnotes. Still, the atmosphere is hard to miss. A careful reading might suggest that the complaint of divine workers, however framed, is the engine that drives the next stage of the myth. The world requires maintenance. The labour is heavy. Those assigned to it do not remain quietly cheerful forever. Even before humanity appears fully in the narrative, the emotional ground is being prepared. Work can become intolerable. Hierarchy can provoke resentment. Burden can force negotiation. That sequence feels ancient, but also embarrassingly current. You do not need a palace archive to understand the universal mood of looking at an unfair workload and thinking absolutely not. A fringe idea proposes that these labour myths preserve a deeper memory of a conflict between divine groups, with the Igigi as figures whose complaint brings humanity into a more complex relationship with the cosmos than later, cleaner versions admit. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it attracts attention because it touches something already present in the story. If beings lower in the divine order are the ones straining under the system, they may become the hinge between heavenly authority and earthly life. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, then labour is not just background to creation. It is the pressure that makes bargaining imaginable. And bargaining is an interesting word, even if the tablets themselves may not phrase things in anything like a legal contract. Let me rephrase that more carefully. We are not yet looking at a signed celestial agreement with witnesses, seals, and an annoyed notary. What we may be approaching is a mythic structure in which the relief of divine burden becomes linked to the existence and role of humanity. The evidence we do have points toward creation as a response to strain. That much is mainstream enough. The interpreted edge is whether this response feels purely imposed from above, or whether traces of negotiation linger in the texture of the story. What if the old myth is really whispering about exhausted hands in muddy fields? Not only human hands, but imagined divine ones too. The gods in these traditions may be larger than life, but they are not always free from labour's logic. Somebody builds, somebody digs, somebody carries, somebody finally refuses. That refusal, whether literal in the myth or symbolic in the storytelling, changes everything. It introduces the possibility that order is not natural and automatic. It must be maintained, it can be resisted, it can be rearranged. You stand for a moment beside dark water reflecting faint starlight. The banks hold for now. The fields beyond lie still. But the whole land seems to hum with remembered effort. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. The documented part is firm. Mesopotamian civilization rests on labour-intensive irrigation and organised work, and its myths often mirror that reality. The interpreted part is that divine complaint in Akkadian tradition may reflect more than simple storytelling convenience. It may encode a deeper awareness of strain within hierarchy. The imagined part is the quietest and perhaps the most haunting. What if the first real movement toward humanity begins not with a blessing, but with overworked beings looking upward and deciding they have carried enough? Back in the city, a lamp gutters low. On some tablet, perhaps not yet copied, perhaps already old, the burden is about to speak. And once burden speaks, creation no longer feels simple. You can sense that before any god declares a grand solution. The pressure has been building through labour, rank, and complaint, and now the story begins to lean toward one of the oldest and strangest questions people ever ask. Why are human beings here at all? Not in the poetic sense where you stare thoughtfully at the stars and pretend your laundry does not exist. In the practical Mesopotamian sense. Why make humans? What job are they for? Who benefits? Who decides? And if you listen closely enough, whether anyone in the story sounds fully comfortable with the answer. What's broadly accepted is that Mesopotamian creation traditions often connect humanity to service. Most historians agree that in these myths, human beings are not introduced as leisurely observers of beauty who spend their afternoons discussing abstract meaning beside decorative fountains. They arrive in a world already running on work. Temples need offerings. Fields need tending. Order needs maintenance. The evidence we do have points to a cultural framework in which people exist within obligations, and myths reflect that fact with almost brutal honesty. It is one of the few creation stories that looks at humanity and seems to say, congratulations, you are now part of operations. And yet even here, the logic is not always as flat as it first appears. You move back through the temple district. In the late night, the air cooler, now the brick slowly giving up the day's heat. A lamp burns in a shrine room. Somewhere, a dog noses through discarded reeds with the focus of an amateur archaeologist. The city sleeps in patches, but the sacred world does not fully sleep. Offerings have rhythms. Watches change. Fires are checked. Writing dries on clay. Everything continues. That constant continuation matters because creation in Mesopotamian myth is not usually about a clean beginning from nothing. It is about organising an already active cosmos under strain. Archaeology suggests that Mesopotamian religion develops in close conversation with urban institutions and agricultural survival. A careful reading might suggest that human origins in these stories are explained not as an isolated miracle, but as a solution to an administrative problem. That sounds unromantic, and it is, but it is also wonderfully revealing. In these traditions, the universe can feel like a household too large for its staff. Someone eventually is going to invent middle management. Humanity may be that invention. One interpretation is that some versions of the story leave room for something more complex than simple command. If divine labour becomes intolerable and humanity is introduced as a response, then the transition may carry the texture of negotiation rather than pure decree. That is not the same as saying the texts describe a formal equal bargain between gods and humans. Let me rephrase that more carefully. The surviving myths often present creation as a response to need, but when a system changes because one group can no longer bear its burden, the result can feel less like effortless authority and more like rearrangement under pressure. That's a possibility, not a certainty. Most historians agree that Mesopotamian texts, such as the Atrahasis tradition, preserved in Akkadian, frame humanity's creation in relation to divine labour and unrest. The details vary across versions and traditions, but the mainstream anchor is stable enough. Humans are made after strain develops among the gods. That much matters enormously for tonight's question. If humanity enters the cosmic story as a replacement or relief force, then human existence is tied from the start to someone else's exhaustion. The mystery is not in whether labour matters, it clearly does. The mystery is whether the tone of that transition hints at something closer to exchange than to raw imposition. Historians still argue whether these creation accounts should be read mainly as mythic theology, social reflection, or veiled commentary on labour and hierarchy in the human world. There is no full consensus, and that is fine. Ancient stories are allowed to do more than one thing at once. They can explain ritual order, reflect social structure, and preserve emotional truths about burden without turning into modern manifestos. Still, if you read slowly, the old material can feel less obedient than later summaries make it sound. Imagine the moment inside the myth. The lower divine beings are tired or angry or simply finished. The higher powers confront a problem. The world needs tending, but the current arrangement is failing. The usual polished image of cosmic order develops a crack right down the centre. A more cautious explanation could be that this is simply narrative tension, the necessary problem before the plot resolves. But if we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, the crack is more interesting than that. It suggests that authority is being forced to respond. Humanity may be born not from calm generosity, but from a system under negotiation with its own limits. You pause beside a dark courtyard basin where the water reflects one crooked slice of moonlight. Even the quiet feels layered now. You can almost hear distant sandals on stone, a murmur from a guard post, the rasp of someone clearing his throat before reading a line aloud. In this world, stories are spoken, copied, interpreted, and lived among real obligations. So when creation is described as a solution to toil, ancient listeners would not hear abstract philosophy alone. They would hear the ordinary logic of institutions. When enough people complain, the system finds new bodies. A fringe idea proposes that this structure preserves the memory of a deal, not necessarily between equal parties, but between weary divine intermediaries and the role humanity would come to fill. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it grows from a real tension in the text. If lower-ranking divine beings push the crisis that leads to creation, then humanity's place in the cosmos may be linked to their refusal more intimately than later, higher-centred traditions are comfortable emphasising. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so, and here it is thin. The texts do not clearly say the Igigi sat down with humanity over refreshments and negotiated terms, Ancient myth is rarely that helpful. But the emotional shape of a bargain can exist without contract language. A careful reading might suggest that when one group's labour is transferred to another, the new relationship carries traces of obligation, substitution, and an easy inheritance. Humanity does not simply appear out of nothing. Humanity enters a pre-existing burden. That is a different mood. It makes people less like decorative creations and more like inheritors of a cosmic workload. You can almost feel the weight settling across the generations, from divine shoulders to human ones, like a tool passed from hand to hand, with no one quite admitting they would rather drop it in the canal. What if human origins in these texts sound less like command and more like a contract? Not a legal contract, no. More like an arrangement forced by necessity. The gods above preserve order. The beings below resist unbearable toil. Humanity is shaped into the middle of that tension. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. The documented part is that Mesopotamian creation traditions connect humanity to the relief of divine labour. The interpreted part is that this transfer may imply something more negotiated in tone than the simple language of obedience suggests. The imagined part is the mood now spreading quietly across the city, across the temple roofs, across the drying tablets. What if the first human role is not merely assigned, but inherited through a desperate rearrangement the highest powers later prefer to describe more cleanly? The lamp in the shrine flickers. The water in the basin trembles once and grows still. And somewhere inside the old Akkadian lines, the logic of creation begins to sound uncomfortably like a deal. Once you start listening for that tone, the language itself begins to feel suspiciously alive. Not suspicious in the dramatic modern sense where you slap red circles on screenshots and announce that everything changes now. More in the quiet, scholarly sense. A repeated phrase, an odd verb, a line that sounds smoother in translation than it does in Akkadian. A gap where certainty should be. The tablet does not leap up and confess its secrets. It just sits there in your palm, warm from the day, as if to say you may stare at me for 6 hours and still leave with 3 possible readings and a headache. Which, to be fair, is how a lot of great literature works. The evidence we do have points to formulaic phrasing as one of the defining features of Mesopotamian literature. Most historians agree that Akkadian texts, like many ancient literary traditions, rely on repeated structures, stock expressions, and familiar verbal patterns. That is not laziness, it is craft. Repetition helps memory, preserves tradition, and anchors meaning across generations of copying. But repetition can also do something else. It can hide subtle differences in plain sight. Where most of the wording is familiar, even a small variation may matter more than it first appears. You settle into the scribal room again, or at least into the idea of one. A low lamp burns with that steady little hiss of oil at work. Shelves hold tablets in rows that look less romantic the longer you stare at them, and more like the ancient equivalents of a filing problem. The smell is clay smoke and old concentration. Somewhere a student mutters signs under his breath, trying to remember a sequence, while also perhaps wondering whether there is a future in goat herding instead. Archaeology suggests that Mesopotamian scribes are trained to memorize lexical lists, model compositions, and standardized forms, which means the language of myth is never totally separate from the habits of the school. A careful reading might suggest that certain phrases survive precisely because they are traditional even when the world around them changes. And when phrases survive, they sometimes carry older meanings forward, like seeds trapped in mud. Most of the mud washes away. One tiny thing remains. One interpretation is that subtle word choices in Akkadian literature may preserve traces of exchange burden or obligation in ways later summaries flatten out. That does not mean every verb is a hidden key to an erased conspiracy. Let me rephrase that more carefully. Ancient languages often have semantic ranges, ritual tones, and literary habits that do not map neatly onto modern English. A term can imply service duty, performance bearing, or obligation depending on context. When modern readers compress all of that into a smooth phrase like created to serve some of the texture disappears. And texture is exactly where a forgotten arrangement, if there was one, might leave its print. Historians still argue whether certain contested lines in Mesopotamian myth should be translated in ways that emphasise forced labour, appointed function, ritual service, or broader maintenance of divine order. That debate may sound small, but it changes the atmosphere of the whole story. If humanity is simply made to perform tasks, the myth feels blunt. If humanity is shaped to assume an inherited burden, the mood shifts. If the wording hints at replacement compensation or structured obligation, then the creation story becomes less like a command shouted from above and more like an adjustment made under pressure. That is a different emotional world. You can feel it as your finger traces the wedges across the clay. Not because you are secretly fluent in Akkadian after one atmospheric evening. You are not. You would absolutely misread something important and accidentally order ceremonial onions for a moon festival. But even from the outside, you can see how fragile meaning is. One broken corner takes a certainty away. One restored sign changes a sentence. One translator prefers a stronger verb. Another prefers caution. And suddenly the question of whether humanity enters the story as property instrument or uneasy substitute becomes more open than casual retellings admit. What's broadly accepted is that Mesopotamian myths are layered compositions with deep traditional roots and long copying histories. A more cautious explanation could be that the so-called hidden bargain is simply a modern over-reading of ordinary mythic language. That is possible. It may even be likely in some cases. Scholars continue to debate how much intentional nuance can be recovered from damaged or heavily formulaic passages. But even the cautious position leaves room for something interesting. Formulaic language does not remove tension. It carries tension in a controlled form. The repeated phrases tell you what a culture wants to sound stable about. The small deviations tell you where stability was harder to maintain. A fringe idea proposes that a single verb or phrase in certain Akkadian renderings preserves the faint residue of a bargain between divine workers and the human role that follows them. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it has appeal because ancient texts often preserve old realities indirectly. Institutions like direct claims. Literature likes pressure seeping through the seams. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, then the bargain is not hiding in a giant missing chapter titled Read Me First. It is hiding in tone function and implication. What if a single verb is doing the quiet work of a vanished agreement? Not proving it, not confirming it. This is suggestive, not conclusive, but imagine a line where the relation between beings is expressed not in pure domination, but in transfer, assignment, or substitution. Imagine another where service is less devotional and more burdensome. Imagine a phrase that sounds routine until you remember the whole story began with divine complaint. Suddenly the language of humanity's role does not float free. It drags the weight of what came before. The mystery is not in whether the Akkadian texts contain words about labour. Of course they do. The mystery is whether some of that labour language still carries the emotional pressure of the earlier crisis. Most historians agree that the scribes who copy these traditions are not inventing from nothing. They inherit old material. If older material once framed the shift from divine toil to human responsibility, in a sharper or more negotiated way, later copying might preserve faint echoes without preserving the whole explanation. That is how memory often works. You forget the argument and remember only the tone someone used when saying fine. You pause, listening to the lamp crackle. Outside night presses softly at the walls. Somewhere a draught moves through the doorway and cools the room just enough to wake your skin. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. The documented part is that Akkadian literature depends heavily on formulaic language and inherited phrasing. The interpreted part is that subtle wording choices may preserve hints of obligation, substitution, or exchange beneath smoother later readings. The imagined part is the scene before you now, a scribe copying carefully, perhaps not fully understanding the oldest layer of the tradition, yet still pressing into clay a phrase whose quiet undertone says more than the official story ever wanted said aloud. And once that undertone is there, however faintly, it is hard to stop hearing it. Because the bargain, if it ever existed in anything like the form later readers imagine, may not survive as a statement. It may survive as grammar with a memory. Grammar with a memory is still memory, even when it stammers. And the Akkadian world stammers quite a lot once you begin comparing versions, fragments, and retellings across centuries. Not because the scribes are careless. In many cases, they are almost painfully careful. But they are working inside a literary tradition that has been copied, translated, adapted, rearranged and preserved through changing cities, dynasties, priesthoods, and political moods. The result is not one clean voice from the deep past. It is a chorus in which some singers know the old lines, some know only the polished version, and some appear to be humming confidently through the part they forgot. What's broadly accepted is that Mesopotamian myths changed over time. Most historians agree that stories travelled across languages and regions, and that later copies often preserve earlier material in altered form. Archaeology suggests that surviving tablets frequently come from library contexts centuries later than the origins of the traditions they contain. So when you read an Akkadian myth, you are not stepping into one frozen historical moment. You are walking into a room full of echoes. That matters because contradictions between versions are not unusual. They are part of the landscape. You leave the little scribal room behind for a while and return to the broader city at night. The streets are quieter now, the traffic of feet reduced to the occasional late errand or temple duty. Moonlight catches on plaster, on pottery rims, on the smooth shoulders of storage jars. A dog watches you with the expression of someone who has already evaluated your usefulness and found it lacking. Overhead the sky stretches clear and immense. Down here the city looks ordered. On the tablets, less so. The evidence we do have points to multiple textual traditions surrounding Mesopotamian creation and divine labour myths. Some are closer to Sumerian roots. Some are preserved in later Akkadian literary forms. Some overlap in striking ways, while others lean harder into certain theological emphases. One interpretation is that contradictions between copies may reflect competing priestly or scholarly agendas, or at least different regional priorities. A more cautious explanation could be that variation is simply the normal result of long literary transmission in an ancient world that does not think about strict canonical uniformity the way some later traditions do. That is probably the safer footing. But even safe footing gets interesting when the differences cluster around power. Historians still argue whether the messiness of the record reflects genuine theological disagreement, practical scribal adaptation, or the basic untidiness of tradition moving through time. That debate matters because people often imagine ancient religion as more stable than it really is. Stability is usually the advertisement. The archive is the backstage area where costumes are half changed and somebody has misplaced a crucial line. If the surviving myths do not agree perfectly on who does what, who complains, or how creation unfolds, that does not weaken the story. It reveals the human system around the story. And human systems protect what they need. Most historians agree that temples and courts in Mesopotamia are not neutral storage boxes for myth. They are institutions with interests, identities, and local loyalties. A city devoted to one god may shape emphasis differently from a city devoted to another. A royal context may prefer a more hierarchical vision than a looser local tradition. A careful reading might suggest that contradictions in the record sometimes align with those differences in context. Not every variant is a political statement, of course. Sometimes a damaged line is just damaged. Sometimes a scribe shortens a passage because he is tired, undertrained, or tragically distracted by the ancient equivalent of lunchtime. But over time, repeated choices create patterns. One interpretation is that those patterns may help explain why the possible relationship between the Igigi and humanity feels suggestive in some readings, yet strangely underdeveloped in others. If lower-ranking divine unrest is important in one layer of the tradition, but less welcome in a later, more elevated divine hierarchy, then the surviving record may preserve both memory and restraint. That is not proof of suppression. This is suggestive, not conclusive, but it does raise the possibility that conflict once sat closer to the centre of the story than some later copies allow. You pause beside a courtyard wall where someone has left a broken jar near the drain channel. Water glimmers faintly at the bottom. A breeze moves through the passage and carries the smell of cooled brick and distant reeds. The city feels held together, yet never fully at ease. That same mood lives in the texts. They are preserved but not seamless, revered but not identical, copied but not frozen. A fringe idea proposes that these contradictions are exactly what you would expect if priestly schools were preserving a story while also trying to domesticate its more troublesome implications. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it has narrative appeal. If divine workers once stand nearer the centre of the story, and humanity's role grows out of their unrest, then later systems that prefer a more stable heavenly order may not erase that older layer completely. Instead, they may soften it, redirect it, or surround it with a more orderly framing. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, the gaps and inconsistencies become less like flaws and more like fingerprints. What if the messiness of the record is exactly where the most human drama survives? Because polished systems usually come later. Real conflict is born untidy. It stumbles, repeats itself, contradicts yesterday's version and leaves awkward fragments behind. A careful reading might suggest that the surviving Akkadian material behaves in just that way. It does not always sound like one final official statement. It sounds like a tradition that has been argued over. Not always openly, not always with one side writing furious replies in the margins, but argued over in emphasis, in wording, in what is expanded and what is left hanging. The mystery is not in finding a perfect hidden tablet that resolves everything with dazzling clarity. The mystery is in admitting that no such tablet may ever exist, and that the imperfect state of the evidence is itself part of the story. Most historians agree that ancient textual transmission is rarely neat. The evidence we do have points to layered preservation, changing contexts, and meaningful ambiguity. That means the question of a deal between the Igigi and humanity cannot be settled like a courtroom case. It can only be approached through patterns, through tone, through the places where later order seems slightly too smooth. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. The documented part is that Mesopotamian myths survive in multiple, shifting textual forms, often copied long after their earliest origins. The interpreted part is that differences between versions may reflect more than random drift. They may reflect changing institutional and theological preferences. The imagined part is the mood now hanging over the city and over the archive alike. What if the old story once sounded rougher, more dangerous to hierarchy? And what if the copies that survive still carry tiny tremors from those older nights of argument? You look toward the temple roofs again, dark against the sky. From a distance, the city seems calm, composed, authoritative. Up close, you can hear the seams. And once you hear the seams, you start noticing how carefully power prefers its stitching. By now, the city around you feels less like a backdrop and more like an argument built in mud brick. Walls define access. Courtyards define rank. Temples define proximity to the divine. Archives define what becomes official memory. Nothing here is random, and nothing stays important for long, unless an institution keeps feeding oil to the lamp. That is as true for myths as it is for kings. A story may begin in one emotional register and end in another, if enough centuries of careful hands decide that neatness is safer than friction. Most historians agree that ancient rulers and temples curated texts to support order, not in the sense that every priest spent his afternoons plotting literary cover-ups with dramatic cloak swishes. Ancient life is usually more practical than that, but practical control can be just as powerful. Which texts are copied, which are taught, which variants are preferred, which myths are associated with which rituals, which divine relationships are emphasized when a kingdom needs legitimacy. The evidence we do have points to a world where writing is never only about preservation, it is also about selection. You move once more toward the temple precinct, where the air still carries faint traces of oil, incense, and yesterday's heat stored inside brick. The night has deepened. Fewer voices drift through the lanes now. A watchman passes with the deliberate pace of a man who is both dutiful and slightly annoyed at being awake. Somewhere behind a wall, an animal shifts in its stall. Above all that, the temple rises in the dark, the kind of structure that reminds you power loves height because height looks like inevitability. Archaeology suggests that Mesopotamian temples are not only sacred spaces, but administrative ones. They manage land labour, goods, and ritual. The sacred and the institutional are not cleanly separate. A careful reading might suggest that myths preserved in such environments are likely to reflect the values of order, continuity, and divine hierarchy that temples exist to maintain. A more cautious explanation could be that this influence is broad rather than manipulative. Institutions do not always need to erase ideas aggressively. Often, they simply reward the versions that sound most useful. That is a quieter kind of editing, and usually a more effective one. Historians still argue whether shifts in Mesopotamian myth reflect deliberate theological management, or the slower drift of tradition through changing political and ritual needs. That's a possibility, not a certainty. But even if no one ever sits down to announce, let us now reduce the awkward implications of divine labour, unrest, the long-term effects may still be similar. Stories that flatter order survive more comfortably inside ordered systems. Stories that complicate hierarchy may remain, but with softened edges. One interpretation is that this may help explain why the possible connection between the Igigi's unrest and humanity's role can feel so powerful in the setup, yet so strangely restrained in what follows. If humanity emerges because of a crisis in divine labour, that is already a slightly embarrassing origin for a perfect cosmic order. It means the system did not unfold serenely. It had to be adjusted under pressure. If lower-ranking divine beings play an important role in forcing that adjustment, then the myth places real leverage below the highest order. That is the sort of thing official theology may prefer to frame carefully. You stop near a side entrance where administrative activity would have passed by day, scribes with tablets, labour supervisors, delivery handlers, people carrying goods, while trying not to make eye contact with anyone who looks like they might assign extra work. The doorway is shut now, but you can imagine the traffic. Grain in, wool in, offerings in, records made, numbers checked, ritual language preserved right beside inventory. Civilization is equal parts devotion and bookkeeping, which is somehow both underwhelming and extremely believable. What's broadly accepted is that Mesopotamian myth often reinforces the legitimacy of divine and earthly order. Kings rule because the gods uphold order. Temples matter because they mediate between divine power and human survival. Humanity serves because service belongs to the structure of reality. One interpretation is that if older traditions contained rougher tensions, later transmission may have polished them into a more dignified surface. not erased entirely, more like temple plaster applied over older brick. The shape remains underneath, but the public face is cleaner. A fringe idea proposes that some cosmic details about the relationship between the Igigi and humanity were softened or gradually removed because they made the high divine order look too dependent on beings below it. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it fits a very old pattern in human institutions. Nobody enjoys advertising that the system needed a crisis to invent its workforce. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, then the so-called erasure is less like a single missing tablet and more like centuries of preference for the smoother version. And honestly, good public relations may be one of humanity's oldest sacred arts. The evidence we do have points to continuity across Mesopotamian myth, but continuity is not the same as transparency. A careful reading might suggest that official religious culture likes to foreground divine majesty, stable hierarchy, and proper service. That framing does not have to be false to be selective. It can be perfectly sincere and still leave less flattering tensions in the half-light. The mystery isn't in whether the Anunnaki and higher divine order are important. They clearly are. The mystery is whether the official emphasis on their authority partially overshadows the more disruptive role played by lower divine complaint in bringing humanity into being. What if the gods in the official version are wearing the polished face of good public relations? Not fake, just polished. That is an important difference. We are not proving anything tonight, we're following clues. The documented clue is institutional context. Most historians agree that temples and royal systems preserve texts in ways that support legitimacy. The interpreted clue is tonal. The surviving myths often acknowledge unrest, but still land on a restored hierarchy. The imagined clue is architectural. The old city itself teaches you how power behaves. It rises above. It smooths surfaces. It frames memory from the high places downward. You listen to the silence around the temple wall. It is not complete silence. It never is. There is always wind in the cracks, a footstep somewhere, a faint animal sound, the soft settling of materials cooling after heat. But it feels curated the way sacred quiet often does. That same curating instinct may live inside the texts. Not every line, not every scribe, not every copy, but enough to matter. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. The documented part is that Mesopotamian temples and courts curated writing within systems that valued order and legitimacy. The interpreted part is that stories of divine labour, unrest, may have been preserved in forms that emphasise restored hierarchy more than disruptive dependence. The imagined part is the mood now hovering over the dark precinct. What if the official version of creation keeps its dignity by letting the highest gods speak most clearly, while the old pressure from below survives only as a faint draft through the seams? And if that is true even partly, then humanity enters the cosmos, not as the simple servant of an unquestioned order. You enter as the solution to a problem the polished version would rather summarise quickly. And being a solution is not quite the same as being beloved. That sounds harsher than it needs to, so let me soften it before you start feeling personally attacked on behalf of ancient humanity. Mesopotamian myths are not emotionless. They can be tender, reverent, tragic, even funny in the dry old way that myths sometimes are when divine beings behave like difficult officials with unlimited power. But when these traditions explain why people exist, they often do so in terms that feel practical before they feel flattering. You are here because the world requires maintenance. You are here because somebody has to carry the burden forward. You are here because cosmic order, for all its majesty, seems to run on task assignment, like every other institution humanity has ever invented. Most historians agree that Mesopotamian people understood themselves as dependent on divine favour, and embedded in structures of service, agriculture, and ritual obligation. What's broadly accepted is that human life in the ancient river valleys is shaped by both the sacred and the practical at once. A person serves household needs, field needs, temple needs, and the expectations of rulers who are very sure this is all part of the proper order of things. The evidence we do have points to a worldview in which humanity stands between earth and heaven, not as an equal partner to the gods, but certainly as more than decorative scenery. You step away from the temple height and back toward the denser living streets, where the city feels more human again. The night is thinning toward the coldest part before dawn. A few hearths still glow behind walls. A baby cries somewhere, the world's oldest reminder that no civilization, however grand, ever truly sleeps. A water jar knocks faintly against a doorway. A pair of sandals lies abandoned near a threshold, their owner trusting that no one will bother stealing something so deeply acquainted with blisters. This is the real place where the myths land, not in the heavens alone, not in abstract theology, but in ordinary human bodies that wake, carry sweat, kneel, cook, mend, and hope the canal wall holds another season. Archaeology suggests that daily life in Mesopotamia depends on routines of work so constant they become almost invisible in official language. A careful reading might suggest that myths about human purpose do not merely justify labour from above. They also try to make sense of the exhausting fact that survival itself is structured as obligation. A more cautious explanation could be that this is simply what agrarian civilization looks like when it tells stories about itself honestly. That may be enough, but it is still revealing. One interpretation is that humanity in these stories occupies a negotiated middle ground, not because the texts describe humans bargaining as equals, but because human existence arises at the intersection of divine need and earthly burden. That is a different emotional position from being shaped solely as passive servants. You are still below the gods, very much below in fact. No one is confusing you with upper management, but you stand in a space created by crisis, transfer, and replacement. You carry work once imagined as belonging elsewhere. That gives humanity a strange dignity inside the very language of burden. Historians still argue whether Mesopotamian myths imagine humanity primarily as temple servants of the gods, as agricultural labourers in a cosmic hierarchy, or as a symbolic answer to broader anxieties about order and survival. The safest answer is probably all of the above, depending on which text and which context you are reading. Ancient stories do not owe us single-use labels. But the middle position remains striking. Humans are earthbound, yes, yet cosmically necessary in the mythic logic. The gods remain superior, yes, but they also rely on human performance of the world's ongoing tasks. That dependence may not sound affectionate, but it is not trivial. And dependence always complicates authority. You pause in a narrow lane where dawn's earliest grey begins to soften the edges of the walls. The smell here is cooler now, less smoke and more damp dust. Somewhere nearby, someone is already awake and grinding grain with the resigned rhythm of a person who understands that breakfast-like empire is built through repetitive force. The sound is strangely calming. It also feels like the whole point. Most historians agree that Mesopotamian religion does not sharply separate divine order from practical maintenance of life. Temples receive offerings because gods sustain the world. Humans work because work keeps the cosmos and the city aligned. One interpretation is that this arrangement makes humanity something like an operating link between the upper divine structure and the fragile lower earth. If that reading holds, then human beings are not merely commanded from above, they are positioned in between. And what sits in between often knows things the top prefers not to dwell on. A fringe idea proposes that this middle position reflects a deeper memory of humanity as reluctant partners of the lower divine workers whose burden they inherit, rather than as purely obedient creations of the highest gods. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it speaks to the emotional texture of the myth. If humans are created in response to divine unrest, then their role is born from friction. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, humanity enters the story already carrying the trace of someone else's refusal. That is a far more unsettling origin than simple obedience. What if your place in the universe is less servant than reluctant partner? Not partner in any modern equal rights sense, of course. No one in ancient Mesopotamia is drafting a celestial workplace charter with wellness provisions and free afternoons by the canal, but partner in the darker sense of inherited function. You do the work because the previous arrangement failed. You maintain the order because the burden had to land somewhere. A careful reading might suggest that this is why the human role in these myths feels both humble and central. Humanity is low in rank, yet indispensable in operation. That tension never fully resolves. The mystery is not in whether Mesopotamian texts imagine humans as subordinate. They do. The mystery is whether that subordination sits on top of a deeper and more awkward truth that the cosmos may require those below more than the polished version likes to admit. The evidence we do have points to a world in which divine greatness and human necessity are bound together through ritual labour and survival. That does not raise hierarchy, it complicates it. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. The documented part is that Mesopotamian people saw themselves as dependent on divine favour, while also carrying the real work of sustaining daily and ritual life. The interpreted part is that humanity's place in creation may reflect a negotiated middle position within the mythic logic shaped by transfer of burden rather than pure decree. The imagined part is the city now breathing toward dawn around you, every house holding sleeping bodies who do not know that in the stories told above them, they may stand not only beneath the gods but between divine orders that needed them more than anyone ever liked to say aloud. A cock crows somewhere with outrageous confidence. The first real light touches the upper bricks, and as the city begins another day of carrying the world, you begin to suspect that the old arrangement between heaven and earth was never as simple as obedience. And then the rivers rise in memory, not all at once, not with thunderous cinematic timing, and a narrator shouting that everything changes now. Ancient flood traditions are stranger than that. They move like old water through the mind, carrying silt from different times, different disasters, different fears. A real river overflows. A city remembers. A story grows. A later scribe copies it. Another tradition folds into it. By the time you meet the flood in Mesopotamian literature, it feels both immediate and old, like a nightmare the culture has been having for generations. Most historians agree that flood traditions run deep through Mesopotamian literature. What's broadly accepted is that texts like the Atrahasis story and the Epic of Gilgamesh preserve major flood narratives, and that these may reflect the environmental reality of life in the river valleys, where water is both giver and destroyer. Archaeology suggests that settlements in Mesopotamia experience repeated challenges from unpredictable flooding, shifting river courses, and ecological pressure. A more cautious explanation could be that the Great Literary Flood is not a direct memory of one single event, but a mythic layering of many crises. That is probably the safer ground. Still, even on safe ground, the flood carries emotional force. You walk now at the edge of first light beyond the tighter lanes where the land opens and the canals begin to resemble veins across the plain. Dawn comes thin and grey. The reeds are still. Mud holds the cold of night. Somewhere in the distance, waterbirds lift suddenly, startled by something you do not see. The whole landscape looks peaceful in that dangerous way floodplains sometimes do, as if calm is only ever a pause between instructions. The evidence we do have points to a Mesopotamian worldview shaped by vulnerability. Crops depend on water, but too much water destroys them. Cities depend on canals, but canals must be managed. Order is always at risk of becoming mess. That same pattern runs through the myths. Divine order must be maintained. human noise can become a problem, labour can become unbearable, systems can fray. One interpretation is that flood stories preserve not only fear of natural disaster, but anxiety about broken relationships within the cosmos. If that reading holds, then the flood is never just weather. It is what happens when the arrangement fails. Historians still argue whether the flood traditions should be read mainly as theological warning, environmental memory, royal ideology, or some combination of all three. There is no full consensus, and that uncertainty suits the material. Ancient myths rarely do only one job. They explain, warn, dramatise and preserve mood all at once. But tonight's question adds another layer. If humanity enters the story as a solution to divine labour, unrest, then the flood may sound different. It may feel less like punishment arriving from nowhere and more like a crisis in an already uneasy agreement. That is a chilling possibility, though, not a certainty. Most historians agree that in the atrahasis tradition, humanity's multiplication and noise become part of the problem that leads to divine attempts at reduction or destruction. The mainstream anchor is clear enough. Humans are made to relieve divine burden, but they do not remain quietly convenient. The system that created them develops friction all over again. A careful reading might suggest that this makes human existence in Mesopotamian myth fundamentally unstable. You are needed but not fully welcomed, useful but potentially disruptive, necessary but also risky. It is not exactly the sort of performance review you would frame on the wall. You kneel near the dark edge of a canal and watch faint ripples move under the paling sky. Water is lovely at a distance. Up close, in a civilization built on levees and channels, it is paperwork with momentum. Every shimmer contains responsibility. Every overflow threatens stored grain, boundary lines, mud walls, and sleep. The physical reality of that vulnerability may help explain why flood myths bite so deeply. A popular rumour claims that the flood in these stories marks the moment the higher gods try to undo an earlier arrangement they regret. There is no solid textual basis for stating that so strongly, but if we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, the flood does begin to look like more than random wrath. It looks like strain returning. One interpretation is that the flood functions as a narrative reminder that transferred burdens do not vanish. They change hands and then they change form. The gods below once resist their work. Humanity inherits that work. Humanity then becomes difficult in its own way through noise, numbers, disorder, or simply presence. A more cautious explanation could be that this is just the recurring Mesopotamian insight that order always has maintenance costs. That may be enough. But it is enough in a very haunting way. The cosmos never becomes simple. The deal, if there is one, never rests peacefully. What if every rising river in the story sounds like a reminder that deals can fray? Not because a tablet plainly says contract breached. Ancient myth is subtler and more infuriating than that, but because the emotional logic keeps returning to the same point. Burden creates crisis. Crisis creates rearrangement. Rearrangement creates new instability. The flood is not only destruction, it is the old pressure coming back in another shape. The mystery isn't in whether Mesopotamian people feared flood. Of course they did. The mystery is whether the flood tradition also preserves the memory that the human role in the cosmos was never fully secure to begin with. A fringe idea proposes that stories of divine regret after human creation preserve echoes of a deeper conflict between the higher gods and the lower beings whose unrest led to humanity's existence in the first place. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it fits a recognizable narrative pattern. If authority solves one crisis by shifting burden downward, it may later resent the consequences of that solution. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. And here, the evidence is more atmospheric than direct. The texts do not openly tie the flood to an Igigi human pact, but they do preserve a world in which the solution to labour unrest does not stay peacefully solved. You rise and look across the brightening plain. The sky is turning silver now, then pale gold near the horizon. A breeze lifts over the water. Somewhere behind you, the city is waking properly, fires being coaxed back to life, doors opening, animals complaining, people beginning another day of carrying what must be carried. That image feels connected to the flood in a quiet way. Life resumes, order resumes, but always under the knowledge that it can fail, and that failure may not be natural alone. It may be relational, sacred, administrative, cosmic. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. The documented part is that major Mesopotamian flood traditions likely reflect both literary theology and a real environmental culture of vulnerability. The interpreted part is that the flood may also signal deeper instability in humanity's role within the divine order, especially if creation itself emerges from crisis. The imagined part is the water before you now moving softly in dawn light, like a memory too old to speak plainly, yet still carrying the feeling that whatever arrangement once linked gods and humans was never fully trusted by all who had to live with it. The reeds whisper, the current slides on, and somewhere inside the old stories, the river keeps remembering what the official version tries not to say too loudly. And yet, the tablets never quite settle the matter. That may be the most honest thing you can say after spending a long night wandering through Akkadian, dust divine, labour-polished, hierarchy, uneasy creation, and flood memory that sounds suspiciously like a recurring problem in cosmic management. By this point you can feel the shape of the theory. You can see why it appeals to people. You can also see why careful readers keep clearing their throats and adding qualifiers. The old texts are not a locked chest that opens with one dramatic twist. They are more like a room of half-burned lamps, each one showing part of the floor and leaving the corners dim. Most historians agree that the surviving Mesopotamian evidence is fragmentary. What's broadly accepted is that we do not possess one single clean narrative laying out the complete relationship between the Igigi, the Anunnaki, and humanity in neat modern terms. We have damaged tablets, variant traditions, later copies of older material, and literary textures that invite interpretation without always rewarding certainty. The evidence we do have points to a real pattern of divine labour, unrest, human creation, and continued cosmic instability. Beyond that, the picture becomes less tidy. You are back in the archive now, though dawn has already come. The room smells less mysterious than it did at midnight. Daylight has that effect. Under daylight, even the most haunting theory has to sit at the same table as damaged edges, missing signs, and the deeply unglamorous fact that ancient storage conditions were not designed for your desire for complete answers. Tablets lie in stacks or baskets, each one carrying both preservation and loss. One corner survives, another does not. One line is legible, the next is gone. Somewhere in all this are the clues people build entire worldviews around. Somewhere else is the missing context that would probably make half the arguments less exciting. A popular rumour claims that there once existed a clearer text, now lost, or deliberately destroyed, that openly described humanity's true alliance with the Igigi against the Anunnaki. There is no good evidence for that claim, and it belongs firmly in the rumour drawer where it can sit with the ancient equivalent of aliens' secret tunnels and everybody's least disciplined cousin. But the rumour does reveal something important. It reveals the emotional appetite the surviving material creates. People do not invent these stories out of nothing. They invent them because the real texts leave open spaces that feel charged. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. One interpretation is that the surviving Akkadian evidence preserves just enough tension to make a lost explanatory layer feel imaginable. Lower divine beings complain. Humanity is created in relation to that complaint. Higher order is restored but never entirely comfortable. Flood and instability follow. A careful reading might suggest that these ingredients naturally invite the idea of a bargain, whether or not the texts ever state it in those terms. A more cautious explanation could be that modern readers are simply connecting separate mythic features into a narrative arc they personally find compelling. That is possible. It may even be happening to some degree right now. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. Still thin evidence is not the same as meaningless evidence. Most historians agree that fragmentary archives require interpretation. Scholars continue to debate how far interpretation can responsibly go before it becomes projection. That line is never perfectly clear. Ancient texts are not inert. They encourage comparison. They create mood. They invite readers to notice patterns. Yet responsible reading means resisting the urge to sprint from suggestive clues to grand conclusions while waving a tablet around like you have solved all human history before breakfast. You have not. You are at best doing what ancient scribes themselves often did, arranging inherited pieces and hoping the result still resembles truth. Historians still argue whether the so-called missing links in Mesopotamian divine history reflect actual lost traditions, later literary simplification, or the ordinary incompleteness of surviving evidence. There is no full consensus. That matters because it keeps your feet on the ground. The ground tonight is real enough. The Igigi appear. Divine labour matters. Humanity's creation responds to pressure. Higher order is emphasised. Flood and instability return. Those are sturdy points. The leap beyond them into claims of a hidden erase pact is where caution becomes necessary. You brush your hand across a tablet's surface, careful not to imagine yourself as the first genius ever to notice ambiguity. Many people before you have noticed. That is why the debate remains alive. A fringe idea proposes that suppressed lines once named humanity's true allies among the gods. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it persists because it dramatizes something already present in the material. Humanity does not emerge from serene harmony. Humanity emerges from strain. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, then the rumour is not useful as fact, but useful as a mirror of the tension the texts genuinely contain. What if the story is pointing at something else? That question has followed you all night, and it still has not become simpler. Perhaps that is the point. The Akkadian record may not be withholding one final answer, so much as preserving a puzzle made of official order and private unrest, high gods and burdened intermediaries, practical labour and cosmic symbolism. The evidence we do have points toward a world where myths help people manage uncertainty, not eliminate it. Ancient listeners may not have demanded a single clean theory any more than they demanded a single clean river. They lived with overflow. They lived with damaged boundaries. They lived with the institutions that presented stability while constantly repairing it underneath. And maybe that is why the possible deal between the Igigi and humanity remains so compelling. Not because the tablets prove it. They do not. But because the theory gives shape to the emotional undercurrent of the myths. It says the burden was passed down through conflict. It says humanity may inherit not just work, but the memory of refusal. It says the polished heavenly order may stand on a compromise it later prefers not to describe too clearly. That's a possibility, not a certainty, but it is one the old record keeps making possible. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. The documented part is that the Akkadian evidence is partial layered and genuinely suggestive without being decisive. The interpreted part is that the pattern of unrest, creation, and recurring instability may raise the possibility of a deeper relationship between the Igigi and humanity than official hierarchy foregrounds. The imagined part is the room around you now, brightening into full morning, while tablets remain stubbornly quiet, as if they know the real power of an archive is not in saying everything, but in leaving just enough unsaid that the question keeps breathing. And this question still breathes. Not loudly, not like a revelation with trumpets, more like dust turning gold in daylight, refusing to settle. That lingering question brings you at last to the scribe, not a famous king, not a booming priest standing on a stairway with divine authority dripping from every syllable, just a scribe, a human being with a reed stylus, a supply of damp clay, trained habits, a sore wrist, and the uncomfortable responsibility of deciding how the past will sound when copied into the future. If tonight's puzzle has felt vast, cosmic, and a little foggy around the edges, this is where it becomes suddenly intimate. Memory does not preserve itself. Somebody has to press it into shape. Most historians agree that scribes in Mesopotamia did far more than take dictation. They copied, standardized, translated, adapted and transmitted inherited traditions across generations. What's broadly accepted is that scribal schools trained students through repetition and model texts, but those same habits also gave scribes subtle power. A tablet can be copied faithfully and still emerge changed. A line can be restored from memory. A damaged phrase can be left unresolved. A familiar expression can be made a little smoother for a new audience. The evidence we do have points to scribes as custodians of tradition, yes, but also as active participants in its survival. You can picture one now, more clearly than before. The city is fully awake outside. Daylight spills over the upper walls, and the street beyond, the scribal room has resumed its ordinary rhythm of footsteps, baskets, complaints, and official purpose. Inside, however, the light falls more softly. It catches the damp sheen of fresh clay and the dry, pale surface of older tablets stacked nearby. The room smells of oil dust and concentration. There is no mystical aura, no secret choir, just labour again in a quieter form, which feels right considering that nearly everything in this world, even sacred memory, depends on somebody doing a difficult, repetitive task carefully enough that later people mistake the result for inevitability. One interpretation is that a nervous copyist may have preserved ambiguity on purpose, not because he is part of an organised resistance movement in the archive, and certainly not because he plans to overthrow divine hierarchy during lunch. Let me rephrase that more carefully. A scribe working with inherited material may encounter phrases, tensions, or theological rough edges that do not fit perfectly with the preferred framing of his own time. In those moments he has choices. He can normalise, he can omit, he can harmonise, or he can preserve the difficulty by copying it as faithfully as he dares, perhaps without fully explaining it. That last possibility matters. Most historians agree that ancient scribes often treated tradition with great conservatism. They were not all eager innovators improvising fresh doctrine every Tuesday, but conservatism itself can preserve old trouble. A careful reading might suggest that ambiguity survives not because institutions enjoy uncertainty, but because scribes are trained to respect inherited wording even when its implications feel awkward. If so, then some of the tension you have been following tonight may endure precisely because one tired hand in lamplight decides not to tidy it away completely. Historians still argue whether textual ambiguities in Mesopotamian literature are better explained by damage, scribal incompetence, inherited complexity, or deliberate preservation of difficult tradition. There is no full consensus, and to be fair, ancient copying includes all of those possibilities at different times. Sometimes a weird line is profound. Sometimes a weird line is just a copyist error produced by fatigue, inattention, or the universal human desire to be done for the day. A more cautious explanation could be that many of the tensions modern readers notice were not consciously preserved as tensions at all. They may simply be the residue of long transmission. That is possible, but residue has a way of becoming meaningful in its own right. You watch the scribe lift the stylus and hesitate. Maybe the tablet before him is damaged. Maybe he is comparing exemplars. Maybe a line naming the divine workers their burden or humanity's role does not sit comfortably with the more polished theological language he has heard elsewhere. Maybe he feels nothing dramatic at all, and is merely deciding whether a broken sign is best restored one way or another. Ancient decisions rarely announce their future importance. That is one of history's favourite little jokes. The hand that preserves a civilization's ambiguity is probably also worried about lunch. A fringe idea proposes that certain copyists intentionally allowed troublesome older material to survive beneath smoother official framing, preserving clues for future readers. This theory isn't widely accepted, and it can easily become too romantic. Ancient scribes are not automatically heroic defenders of forbidden truth. Most of them are trained professionals serving institutions. But if we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, then the archive becomes more interesting. Not because it contains secret rebellion in every line, but because human beings often preserve more than they openly endorse. Respect for tradition can keep old discomfort alive. What if one tired hand in lamplight kept the whole question alive? Not by writing an explicit confession, not by adding in the margin, by the way the official version is smoothing over a much rougher deal. Ancient scribes are frustratingly bad at providing modern readers with convenient editorial notes, but perhaps by refusing to flatten every inherited wrinkle, by copying the old phrase instead of replacing it, by preserving a divine title whose implications had become awkward, by leaving a gap open rather than forcing a clean solution. A careful reading might suggest that ambiguity itself can be an act of preservation. The evidence we do have points to the importance of scribal continuity in sustaining Mesopotamian myth across enormous spans of time. Without scribes, the Igigi vanish, the Anunnaki vanish, the labour complaint vanishes, the flood vanishes, humanity's uneasy role vanishes, everything tonight disappears back into mud. That reality gives the scribe an almost invisible grandeur. He is not above the system, he works inside it, yet he mediates between the official and the inherited, between order and memory, between what a culture wants to say cleanly and what its oldest stories refuse to say cleanly. You notice again how much this resembles the broader human world. Families do it, states do it, religions do it, institutions tell the version that best supports continuity. Individuals preserve the odd detail, the awkward phrase, the half-explained story that refuses to vanish. Not always intentionally, not always bravely, sometimes simply because accuracy, habit, or reverence demands it. Most historians agree that scribes are central to Mesopotamian cultural continuity. One interpretation is that they may also be the reason unresolved tensions remain recoverable at all. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. The documented part is that individual scribes copied and reshaped inherited traditions, sometimes preserving difficult older material within newer contexts. The interpreted part is that a copyist may, through caution or fidelity, have allowed ambiguous traces of a deeper Igigi human connection to endure. The imagined part is the room before you now lit by morning, yet still carrying the hush of night work, where one ordinary man presses wedges into clay and unknowingly ensures that thousands of years later, someone like you can still feel the old question breathing through the official story. Outside the city grows louder. Inside the stylus touches clay again. And with that small dry click, the puzzle survives another century. And once the puzzle survives, it changes shape. At first it looks like a historical question. Then it starts behaving more like a literary one. Then if you stay with it long enough, it becomes something quieter and stranger, a question about how ancient people used myth to think through dependence burden and the uncomfortable truth that order often rests on somebody else's work. By now, you have walked through temples, archives, canal edges, flood memory, and the tired hand of the scribe. The big dramatic version of the theory, the one with secret revelations and total certainty, has mostly dissolved. What remains is slower, and in some ways more interesting. Most historians agree that Mesopotamian myths speak in layered symbolism rather than modern legal language. What's broadly accepted is that the stories do not present cosmic relationships with the precision of contract statutes or political manifestos. They are myths, not meeting minutes. They explain the world through image pattern and sacred narrative. A more cautious explanation could be that the so-called deal between the Igigi and humanity is best understood not as a literal agreement, but as a metaphorical structure built into the story's logic. That may not sound as thrilling as a hidden pact in baked clay, but it may actually fit the evidence better. And honestly, metaphor is usually where old stories hide their sharpest teeth. You walk now beneath the full light of morning along the edge of a street where the city's day has completely begun. Bakers are awake, porters are moving, somebody is already arguing about delivery timing with the solemn intensity of a man defending civilization itself. A child runs past and is immediately told not to, which is probably the most historically stable feature of human culture. Overhead, linen flutters. Ahead, the temple still rises. The city is alive, not only because it exists, but because people keep sustaining it. That simple fact may be the closest thing to the story's true contract. The evidence we do have points to mutual dependence, though not equal dependence, embedded all through Mesopotamian life and myth. Gods depend on ritual. Temples depend on labour. Fields depend on water control. Kings depend on divine legitimacy. Households depend on grain, wool timing, and luck. One interpretation is that the creation stories compress all of this into symbolic form. Humanity exists because the cosmos, as imagined in these traditions, requires maintenance. The lower divine burden becomes the narrative doorway through which human necessity enters. If that reading holds, then the deal is not written in legal terms because it lives at the level of function. Historians still argue whether the labour and creation myths should be read mainly as reflections of social hierarchy or as theological explanations for the place of humanity in a divinely ordered universe. There is no full consensus, and that is fine. The best ancient stories usually refuse to sit still inside one category. A careful reading might suggest that the power of the Igigi human theory lies precisely in this overlap. It is compelling because it turns symbolic burden into relationship. It says that humans do not merely serve because high gods command it. They serve because the whole structure of the world, divine and earthly alike, has been reorganized around transferred work. That is a heavier idea than simple obedience. A fringe idea proposes that the so-called deal should be understood almost politically as a buried memory of compromise between different divine factions and the humanity caught between them. This theory isn't widely accepted, and it may push the evidence too far if stated too strongly. But if we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, it does help illuminate something real in the myths. The transition from divine toil to human obligation does not feel emotionally neutral. It feels charged. It feels like the aftermath of pressure. Even if the deal is metaphor rather than event, the metaphor still points toward a world in which burden changes hands because harmony has failed. What if the contract lives not in law but in the feeling of mutual dependence? Not equal, never equal. The gods still outrank humanity by an absurd distance. No one is mistaking a field worker for a member of the divine board. But mutual dependence does not require equality. It only requires that the system break if one layer stops functioning. Humans need the gods for order, fertility, legitimacy, and cosmic structure. The gods, in mythic terms, need humans for labour, offerings, maintenance, and continuity of the world below. That relationship may be hierarchical, but it is not one-sided in practice. And one-sided stories are often the ones institutions prefer to tell most clearly. You stop near a workyard where baskets, tools and reed bundles have been stacked in patient ordinary rows. Nothing about the scene looks mysterious. That is exactly why it matters. Mesopotamian civilization does not survive on dramatic revelations. It survives on repetition. Carry, mix, shape, dry measure record, offer, repair, repeat. The myths do not float above that rhythm. They breathe it. A careful reading might suggest that the Igigi story carries such power because it gives that rhythm a divine prehistory. Work existed before humanity. Work was unbearable. Humanity inherits it. That sequence feels less like abstract theology and more like the deep story of civilization itself. Most historians agree that the ancient evidence does not justify absolute claims about hidden erased truths. To be clear, this is debated. The surviving tablets allow interpretation, not certainty. But interpretation matters. The mystery isn't in proving a literal cosmic treaty. The mystery is in recognizing how close the story comes to saying that the world is held together by transferred obligation. The higher order may rule, but the lower levels carry. That pattern is social sacred and painfully familiar. A popular rumour claims that if we could recover one missing tablet, the whole arrangement would suddenly become obvious. Maybe. Or maybe a missing tablet would simply add new ambiguity and ruin somebody's best-selling certainty tour. Ancient evidence is rude that way. Still, the fragments already say enough to keep the question alive. They say burden matters. They say hierarchy is unstable under strain. They say humanity enters the story because someone else could no longer bear the load. That is already more unsettling than the clean official version. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. The documented part is that Mesopotamian myths operate symbolically and consistently connect human purpose to the relief of divine burden. The interpreted part is that the supposed deal may be best understood as a metaphorical structure of transferred obligation and mutual dependence, rather than a literal hidden contract. The imagined part is the city around you now, bright under morning sun, every task underway, every ordinary person unknowingly reenacting the oldest pattern in the story. The world continues because someone below carries what someone above can no longer carry alone. And that may be the closest you come to reading the bargain clearly. Not on a tablet, in the rhythm of the city itself. And by the time you see it in the rhythm of the city, the last tablet no longer feels like an object alone. It feels like a window with part of the shutter missing. You stand at the edge of the morning in ancient Mesopotamia, with the streets fully awake behind you, and the older world still lingering in your mind, like the smell of clay after cool night air. Bakers are shaping dough. Porters are shifting loads from one courtyard to another. A scribe somewhere is already bending to his task with the resigned discipline of a man who knows the signs will not impress themselves into the tablet out of kindness. The temples still rise. The canals still need tending. The grain still needs measuring. Everything continues. And that more than any dramatic revelation may be the key to the whole puzzle. Archaeology suggests that the surviving tablets give us only a partial window into Akkadian thought. Most historians agree that what reaches the present is fragmentary, selective, and preserved through the choices of time storage, copying, and chance. What's broadly accepted is not a neat final answer, but a strong pattern. The Igigi appear as a meaningful divine group. Divine labour and complaint matter. Humanity is created in response to strain. Higher divine order remains central in the surviving versions. Flood and instability return later as reminders that creation does not solve every tension. The evidence we do have points to a story built from burden hierarchy and an easy continuation. One interpretation is that the Igigi story may reflect a memory the more Anunnaki-centered tradition tried to overshadow rather than erase completely. That is a possibility, not a certainty. Let me rephrase that more carefully. The surviving myths do not show a clean deletion of one worldview by another. They show emphasis, they show framing, they show the high divine order standing clear in the official light, while traces of lower unrest and transferred obligation remain audible underneath. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. It is thin when people claim a lost hidden truth with total confidence. It is much firmer when they say the preserved story still sounds like it remembers conflict from below. Historians still argue whether the relationship between the Igigi, the Anunnaki, and humanity should be read as a layered theological development, a symbolic expression of labour hierarchy, or a literary memory of tensions later systems prefer to smooth. There is no full consensus. That uncertainty is not a flaw in the story. It is part of the story. Ancient Mesopotamian myth is not a polished marble statue. It's more like a mud brick wall repaired across generations. Some bricks are old, some are new, some are cracked, and some are covered with clean plaster that does not quite hide the shape underneath. A fringe idea proposes that the Igigi once stood closer to humanity in the tradition than the later emphasis on higher divine authority comfortably allowed. This theory isn't widely accepted, but if we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, it gives emotional coherence to much of what you have followed tonight. The lower divine beings carry labour. They resist. Humanity enters the story through that rupture. The higher order resumes control, but not without signs of strain. What if the final truth is not a revelation, but a quiet puzzle waiting in the dust? That question has been with you from the first broken tablet, and now in the full light of day it feels gentler than before. Not because it is solved. It is not solved. We are not proving anything tonight, we're following clues. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. The documented part is strong enough to stand on. Mesopotamian civilization was built on labour hierarchy and systems of sacred and practical dependence. The myths mirror that world with startling honesty. The interpreted part is that humanity's creation may carry the residue of an older and rougher divine tension than the smoother official hierarchy fully admits. The imagined part is the feeling that remains when you set the tablet down, that somewhere beneath the names of the great gods and the polished language of order, there lingers the memory of weary beings who changed the world by refusing to carry it alone. And now the pace softens. The city is no longer a puzzle to solve, but a place to leave gently. The sun has climbed high enough to warm the upper bricks, but in your mind, the cooler hours remain. The quiet archive, the lamp hiss, the damp tablet drying slowly, the canal water moving before dawn like dark silk drawn by an unseen hand. The scribe pausing over a line, not knowing that thousands of years later someone will still be listening for the undertone he pressed into clay. You let the sharper questions settle. The Igigi, whether worker gods, younger gods, or shifting divine figures in an inherited tradition, no longer need to stand as a perfect category. They can remain what the tablets allow them to be, part name, part function, part atmosphere. The Anunnaki, great and elevated in the surviving order, no longer need to be villains in some tidy hidden drama. They can remain what the evidence suggests, powerful divine authorities within a world that liked its rank visible. Humanity, as ever, stays in the middle, carrying, serving, enduring, necessary though, not always comforted by the role. And perhaps that is why the story lingers so well at bedtime, because it understands something you already know in quieter parts of your life. That much of the world is built on unseen effort, that official stories are often smoother than lived ones, that what is passed down can carry more than duty, it can carry memory, a mood, a bruise in the narrative, a sense that the arrangement was made under pressure and never entirely forgot that pressure. So the last image is not of a revelation, it is of dust motes, drifting in a shaft of morning light across an Akkadian tablet, while outside the city continues its patient work. Someone lifts water, someone measures grain, someone scratches signs into clay. The rivers move on, the temples stand, the stories remain partial, and the old question softened now rests where it belongs, not as a certainty but as a calm and enduring possibility in the mist between what the tablets say and what they only seem to remember. Sleepy Dusty Unfinished, which is in its own way the perfect place to leave an ancient mystery.